Detective Sarah Chen pressed the blood-soaked photograph against the interrogation room table. Her eyes locked on the man sitting across from her. Marcus Holloway's hands trembled as he stared at the image of his wife's lifeless body sprawled across their kitchen floor, her blonde hair matted with crimson. "Your fingerprints are on the murder weapon, Marcus," Chen said coldly. "Your DNA is under her fingernails. And according to 3 witnesses, you were heard screaming at Rebecca just hours before she died." She leaned forward. "So tell me, why shouldn't I charge you with first-degree murder right now?" Marcus looked up with hollow eyes, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I loved her. And because someone wanted me to look guilty." He paused, his next words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "I think they wanted us both dead." 6 months earlier, Marcus Holloway had always prided himself on being ordinary. At 34, he taught high school chemistry at Jefferson High, lived in a modest suburban home on Maple Street, and had been happily married to Rebecca for 8 years. She worked as a graphic designer from their converted spare bedroom, and their biggest excitement was usually deciding what to order for dinner or which Netflix series to binge-watch next. Their routine was comfortable, predictable. Marcus left for school at 7:15 every morning, coffee in a travel mug Rebecca had bought him for their 5th anniversary. She would kiss him goodbye at the door, sometimes still in her pajamas, her auburn hair messy from sleep. He'd grade papers in the evening while she worked on client projects, both of them content in their quiet, unremarkable life. Marcus had worked hard to build this ordinary existence. After the chaos of his childhood, an alcoholic father who'd abandoned the family when Marcus was 12, a mother who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, craved stability above all else. Rebecca understood this about him, never pushing for grand adventures or dramatic changes. She seemed to understand that, for Marcus, happiness meant safety, and safety meant routine. That ordinary life began to unravel on a Tuesday morning when he found the first note. It was tucked under his windshield wiper when he left school, written in precise block letters on expensive paper. "You took something that wasn't yours. Time to pay." Marcus read it twice, then looked around the nearly empty parking lot. Only a few cars remained: Mrs. Patterson's ancient Honda, Coach Rivera's pickup truck, and the custodian's van. The autumn wind scattered leaves across the asphalt, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the marching band practicing for Friday's game. A prank from one of his students, probably. God knows they had elaborate ways of getting revenge for pop quizzes and weekend homework assignments. Just last month, someone had filled his desk drawers with Jell-O. This seemed more sophisticated, but teenagers were getting more creative with their pranks these days. Marcus crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash bin near the school entrance, already dismissing it from his mind as he drove home through the familiar suburban streets. The second note appeared 3 days later, slipped through the mail slot of his front door. "She knows nothing. Keep it that way if you want her to stay safe." This time, Marcus kept the note. He sat in his car for 10 minutes after finding it, reading and rereading the words. The handwriting was identical to the first note, those same precise block letters, written with what looked like an expensive pen on heavy cardstock. This wasn't a student prank. Someone was watching his house, knew about Rebecca, and felt confident enough to approach his front door in broad daylight. Marcus looked up and down their quiet street, searching for anything out of place. The Thompsons' lawn sprinkler was running as usual. Mrs. Garcia was tending to her rose bushes across the street, waving when she caught his eye. Everything appeared normal, but Marcus felt exposed, vulnerable. That evening, he showed the note to Rebecca over dinner. She'd made his favorite meal chicken piccata with garlic mashed potatoes, but Marcus found himself pushing food around his plate instead of eating. "Maybe we should call the police," she said, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. Rebecca had always been the practical one in their relationship, quick to address problems head-on, while Marcus tended to overthink everything. "And tell them what? Someone's playing pranks?" Marcus shook his head. "Besides, I have no idea what they think I took." Rebecca studied her husband's face carefully. After 8 years of marriage, she could read his expressions like a favorite book, the slight twitch of his left eye when he was nervous, the way he rubbed his thumb against his index finger when he was hiding something. "Are you sure about that?" What do you mean? You get this look when you're hiding something. Like when you forgot to mention you'd been laid off from the lab job before we met. She set down her fork and leaned forward. Or when you didn't tell me about your mother's gambling problem until after we were married. Marcus felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. Rebecca was right, did have a tendency to withhold information, usually to protect people he cared about from worry or disappointment. But this time was different. That was different. I was embarrassed. What aren't you telling me, Marcus? He reached across the table and took her hand. Nothing, Becca, I promise. I have no idea what this is about. It was only half a lie. He truly didn't understand the notes. But there was something he'd never told Rebecca, something from his past, that he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it never happened. The third note arrived a week later, and this one made his blood run cold. Apartment 4B. Fire on March 15th, 2018. Remember now? Marcus's hands shook as he read the words. March 15th, 2018. The date was burned into his memory, though he'd spent 6 years trying to forget it. He'd been living in Chicago then, working as a research assistant while finishing his master's degree. The apartment was a cramped one-bedroom in a converted brownstone, not much, but all he could afford on his graduate student stipend. The building had caught fire in the middle of the Knighton electrical fault, the investigators said. Marcus had escaped through a window, rappelling down a fire escape ladder he'd practiced using during the mandatory safety drills. But his upstairs neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, hadn't been so lucky. For months afterward, the guilt had eaten at him like acid, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he could have done more. He'd heard her calling for help, had seen smoke coming from under her door, but instead of trying to help her, he'd panicked and saved himself. The rational part of his mind knew he'd made the right choice. He wasn't trained for rescue operations, and going back could have killed them both. But the rational part of his mind had never been loud enough to drown out the voice that whispered he was a coward. The nightmares had started immediately after the fire. Dreams where he climbed the stairs instead of descending them, where he broke down Mrs. Chen's door and carried her to safety. Dreams where he was the hero instead of the survivor. He'd seen a therapist for 6 months, had worked through the survivor's guilt with cognitive behavioral therapy and medication. By the time he moved back to his hometown and met Rebecca, he'd convinced himself he'd processed the trauma and moved on. Or at least, that's what he'd always told himself. Now, staring at the note, fragments of that night began resurfacing, details he'd suppressed, memories he'd locked away, the smell of gasoline in the hallway, sharp and chemical beneath the smoke. The sound of footsteps on the stairs after everyone should have evacuated, heavy boots moving with purpose. The man in the dark coat he'd seen leaving the building just before the fire started, walking calmly away while sirens wailed in the distance. Marcus drove to the public library and spent 3 hours researching the fire online. What he found made his stomach turn. Mrs. Chen hadn't just been an elderly neighbor. She'd been a retired forensic accountant who'd been investigating embezzlement at a major construction company called Midwest Development Corp. The case had gone cold after her death, all her files lost in the fire. According to the Chicago Tribune archives, Mrs. Chen had been preparing to testify before a grand jury about fraudulent billing practices that had cost the city millions in overruns on public works projects. Her investigation had uncovered a web of corruption involving city officials, construction executives, and organized crime figures. The grand jury had been scheduled to hear her testimony on March 20th, 2018, 5 days after the fire that killed her. Marcus found himself reading article after article about the woman he'd failed to save. Helen Chen, 73, survived by 3 children and 8 grandchildren. Former CPA who had built a reputation for meticulous attention to detail and unwavering ethical standards. After her retirement, she'd volunteered her services to investigate white-collar crime, working pro bono for the district attorney's office. The articles painted a picture of a woman who dedicated her life to exposing corruption and protecting public funds from thieves in expensive suits. Her death had closed the door on what prosecutors had called one of the most significant corruption cases in Chicago's recent history. Marcus printed out several of the articles and sat in his car in the library parking lot, reading them again. Mrs. Chen had died clutching a briefcase, according to the fire marshal's report. The case had been damaged beyond repair in the blaze, its contents reduced to ash. With her files destroyed and her testimony silenced forever, the grand jury had been forced to abandon their investigation. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the man in the dark coat, trying to remember his face. Had he been tall or short, young or old? The memory was frustratingly vague, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Around 3 a.m., his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're remembering. Good. Now forget again, or your wife pays the price." The stalking escalated quickly after that. Marcus would catch glimpses of someone following him, a man in a baseball cap who seemed to disappear whenever Marcus tried to get a better look. The same figure appeared in his peripheral vision at the grocery store, at the gas station, even lurking near the school parking lot after hours. His car tires were slashed twice in 1 week. The first time, Marcus had dismissed it as random vandalism. The second time, he found a note tucked under his windshield wiper. "Next time, it won't be your tires." Strange packages began arriving at their house. Dead roses wrapped in elegant paper. Photos of Rebecca taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Recordings of their private conversations played back on cheap cassette tapes. The recordings were the most disturbing intimate moments between husband and wife, captured through sophisticated surveillance equipment. Someone had been listening to them for weeks, maybe months. Rebecca grew increasingly frightened and frustrated with Marcus's refusal to involve the police. "This is insane," she said one evening, holding up a photo that showed her leaving the grocery store, her face circled in red ink. The timestamp indicated it had been taken just 2 hours earlier. "Someone is stalking us, threatening us, and you won't even file a report." "The police can't protect us from someone we can't identify," Marcus replied, though he knew his reasoning was flawed. "Then what do you suggest?" "We can't live like this." Rebecca's voice cracked with stress and exhaustion. She'd been sleeping poorly, jumping at every sound, checking the locks obsessively. "I'm afraid to leave the house alone. I'm afraid to stay home alone. I feel like I'm losing my mind." Marcus looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw how much the stalking had affected her. Dark circles shadowed her eyes. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her normally curvy frame. Her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't watching. "Maybe we should go away for a while," he suggested. "Visit your sister in Portland. Take a vacation until this blows over. Running away won't solve anything. Besides, how do we know they won't follow us?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question. The notes had stopped after that third one about Mrs. Chen, but the surveillance continued. He'd started carrying a baseball bat in his car and checking all the locks twice before bed. He'd installed motion sensor lights around their house and set up a security camera system that Rebecca had insisted on. But he couldn't shake the feeling that his stalker was always one step ahead, always watching, always waiting. The truth was, Marcus was terrified that involving the police would make things worse. Because the more he remembered about the night of the fire, the more he realized he might not be just a witness, she might be an accomplice. 3 days before Rebecca's murder, Marcus finally remembered everything. It had been around 11 p.m. on March 15th, 2018. Marcus was in his apartment, studying for exams, when someone knocked on his door. He opened it to find a well-dressed man in his 50s with cold eyes and an expensive suit. "Marcus Holloway?" the man asked. "Yes? My name is Vincent Carrera. I represent certain business interests in the city. I understand you work as a research assistant?" Marcus nodded, confused. "I have a proposition for you. There's an elderly woman in apartment 4B, Mrs. Chen. She has some files in her possession that belong to my clients. We'd like them back." "I don't understand. What does this have to do with me?" Carrera smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're going to help us retrieve them. Tonight." "I'm not breaking into anyone's apartment." "You're not breaking in. You're going to knock on her door, tell her there's a gas leak in the building, and convince her to evacuate. Once she's gone, my associates will collect what belongs to them." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Absolutely not." Carrera's expression hardened. "Your student loan debt is quite substantial, isn't it? And your mother's medical bills from her cancer treatment, those must be difficult to manage on a research assistant's salary." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "How do you know about that?" "I know a lot of things, Mr. Holloway. I know you've been selling your plasma twice a week to make rent. I know you've been skipping meals to afford your mother's medications. I also know that refusing to help us would be unfortunate for both you and your family." Carrera reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "There's $10,000 in here, enough to catch up on your mother's bills and still have some left over. All you have to do is knock on a door." Marcus stared at the envelope, his mind racing. $10,000 would solve all his problems, and all he had to do was convince an old woman to leave her apartment for a few minutes. "She won't get hurt?" he asked. "Not a hair on her head. You have my word." Against every instinct screaming at him to refuse, Marcus took the envelope. 20 minutes later, he knocked on Mrs. Chen's door. "There's been a gas leak reported in the building," he lied, hating himself with every word. "The fire department wants everyone to evacuate immediately." Mrs. Chen, a tiny woman in her 70s, grabbed her purse and followed him downstairs. They stood outside in the cold while Carrera's men entered the building. That's when everything went wrong. Instead of simply retrieving files, they'd set the building on fire. Marcus watched in horror as flames engulfed the upper floors. Mrs. Chen tried to run back inside, screaming about important documents she'd left behind, but the fire spread too quickly. She died of smoke inhalation on the 4th floor, clutching a briefcase full of evidence that could have sent Carrera and his associates to prison for decades. Marcus had been paid to be an accessory to murder, and he'd been too cowardly and desperate to realize it until it was too late. Now, 6 years later, someone knew what he'd done. Someone was making him pay. The final realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been living with this guilt for 6 years, but he'd never been the only one who knew the truth. Vincent Carrera had known all along. He'd probably been watching Marcus ever since, waiting for the right moment to collect on his investment. Marcus decided he had to tell Rebecca everything. She deserved to know the truth before the situation got any worse. She deserved to understand why their lives had been turned upside down, why they were being stalked and threatened. Most importantly, she deserved the chance to decide for herself whether she wanted to stay married to a man who'd helped commit murder. He planned to sit her down that evening after dinner and confess his role in Mrs. Chen's death. He would explain about the blackmail, the notes, the surveillance. Then they would go to the police together, and he would turn himself in, regardless of the consequences. It was time to stop running from his past and face what he'd done. He practiced the conversation during his lunch break, sitting in his empty classroom while students ate in the cafeteria. "Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you about Chicago," he said to the empty room. "Something I should have told you years ago." The words felt clumsy and inadequate. How do you tell someone you love that you're responsible for an innocent person's death? Marcus left school early that day, telling his principal he had a family emergency. In a way, it was true. He stopped at a florist and bought Rebecca her favorite flowers, white lilies with baby's breath. It seemed like a pathetic gesture considering what he was about to confess, but he wanted to do something kind before he destroyed their marriage forever. He never got the chance. Marcus arrived home from school at 4:30 p.m. to find Rebecca's car in the driveway and the front door slightly ajar. The sight of that partially open door sent ice through his veins. Rebecca was obsessive about home security, especially since the stalking had begun. She would never leave the door unlocked, let alone open. He set the flowers on the porch and pulled out his phone, finger hovering over 911. But something held him back, maybe the desperate hope that he was overreacting, that Rebecca had simply stepped outside to get the mail and forgotten to close the door behind her. "Becca," he called as he pushed the door open wider. "Rebecca, are you home?" No response. The house felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too still. The living room looked normal at first glance, But Marcus noticed small details that set off alarm bells in his mind. Rebecca's laptop was closed on the coffee table, though she always left it open when she was working. Her reading glasses were on the floor beside the couch, as if they'd been knocked off. A throw pillow lay on the hardwood instead of on the sofa where it belonged. Marcus walked through the house systematically, calling Rebecca's name. The kitchen was where his worst fears became reality. He found her lying in a pool of blood with a knife beside her body, the same knife he'd used that morning to cut oranges for breakfast, fingerprints still on the handle. Rebecca lay on her side, her auburn hair fanned across the white tile floor, now stained crimson. Her eyes were closed, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to hope she was merely unconscious. But the amount of blood told a different story. In her clenched fist was a note, "Now you know how it feels to lose someone innocent." Marcus dropped to his knees beside his wife's body, pulling out his phone to call 911. As he waited for the paramedics, he noticed something else. Rebecca's fingernails were bloody, as if she'd fought with her attacker. DNA evidence that would later implicate him. But Marcus knew Rebecca hadn't fought him. She'd fought someone else, someone who wanted to make sure Marcus looked guilty. The sirens were already approaching when Marcus found the final piece of the puzzle. Tucked behind the refrigerator was a small digital camera, still recording. Someone had filmed Rebecca's murder and wanted Marcus to find it. On the camera's display, he watched the last minutes of his wife's life. The killer wore a mask, but Marcus recognized the voice immediately. Vincent Carrera. "Tell your husband," Carrera said to Rebecca as she lay dying, "that some debts can never be repaid." Present day, interrogation room. Detective Chen studied Marcus's face as he finished his story. She'd heard a lot of confessions in her 20-year career, but this one felt different. "So you're claiming you were set up by the same man who paid you to help murder my grandmother 6 years ago?" she asked. Marcus's head snapped up. "Your grandmother?" "Mrs. Helen Chen. She raised me after my parents died. She was the strongest, most ethical person I ever knew." Detective Chen's voice remained steady, but her eyes burned with controlled fury. "She spent her last years investigating corruption because she believed justice mattered more than personal safety." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Detective Chen had been assigned to this case specifically because of her connection to the original crime. "You've been investigating me," Marcus said quietly, "for 3 years. Ever since I became a detective and reopened her case, I knew someone had helped them get to her that night, but I could never prove it." She leaned back in her chair. "Imagine my surprise when Vincent Carrera walked into my office 2 weeks ago with a confession and evidence of your involvement." "He confessed?" "Terminal cancer. 6 months to live. Apparently, he wanted to clear his conscience before he died." Chen's smile was razor sharp. "He provided us with recordings of your conversations, photos of you taking the money, even testimony about how you lured my grandmother out of her apartment so his men could plant the accelerant." Marcus felt the walls closing in around him. "But he killed Rebecca. I have the recording." "The recording that was conveniently left for you to find? The one that shows a masked killer whose voice sounds like Carrera but could be anyone with a voice modulator?" Chen stood up and walked to the door. "Here's what I think happened, Marcus. Carrera got tired of paying you hush money over the years, so he decided to eliminate both loose ends, you and your wife. He killed Rebecca, set you up to take the fall, then confessed to the original crime to make sure you'd go down for both murders. But that doesn't make sense. If he confessed to killing your grandmother, why would he need to frame me for Rebecca's murder?" "Because my grandmother's murder is past the statute of limitations for some charges, and Carrera's dying anyway. But your wife's murder? That's a fresh kill. Life in prison or the death penalty." Chen opened the door. "Either way, you finally pay for what you did to an innocent old woman." As Chen left the room, Marcus realized the horrible truth. Carrera had orchestrated the perfect revenge. By killing Rebecca and framing Marcus, he'd ensured that Marcus would suffer the same loss he'd caused 6 years ago and then spend the rest of his life in prison for it. But the cruelest irony was that Detective Chen, in her pursuit of justice for her grandmother, had become an unwitting instrument of a murderer's revenge. 6 months later, Marcus Holloway was convicted of murdering his wife and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The case made national news as a story of delayed justice. A man who'd helped murder an elderly woman finally brought to account for his crimes. The trial had been a media circus. Prosecutors painted Marcus as a cold-blooded killer who'd murdered his wife to prevent her from discovering his dark past. They presented evidence of his financial desperation 6 years earlier, his involvement in Mrs. Chen's death, and the mounting pressure from blackmail that had driven him to violence. The defense had tried to present Marcus's version of events, the elaborate frame job orchestrated by Vincent Carrera, but without Carrera alive to contradict his confession, it sounded like the desperate fiction of a guilty man. The mysterious surveillance, the threatening notes, the perfectly timed setup, it all seemed too convenient, too elaborate to be believable. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Detective Sarah Chen was promoted to sergeant for her outstanding work on the case. She gave interviews to several crime shows, discussing the importance of never giving up on cold cases. She kept a photo of her grandmother on her desk and felt, for the first time in years, that Helen Chen could finally rest in peace. Vincent Carrera died 3 weeks after the trial, taking his secrets with him to the grave. His obituary described him as a reformed businessman who helped solve a cold case before his passing. It mentioned his charitable work in his final years, his generous donations to cancer research, and his cooperation with law enforcement in bringing a killer to justice. No one questioned the timing of his confession. No one wondered why a dying man would suddenly develop a conscience about a 6-year-old crime. The case was closed, justice was served, and everyone could move on with their lives. Everyone except Marcus. In his prison cell at Menard Correctional Center, Marcus stared at the small television showing news coverage of Carrera's death. The reporter described him as a reformed criminal who helped solve a cold case before his passing. No one mentioned that Carrera had been a murderer to the very end. No one questioned whether justice had truly been served, or whether they'd all been playing roles in a dead man's final, elaborate scheme for revenge. The other inmates had learned to leave Marcus alone. He wasn't violent or confrontational, but there was something in his eyes, hollow, haunted quality that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. He spent most of his time in his cell, reading books from the prison library and writing letters that he never sent. On the anniversary of Rebecca's death, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Detective Chen sat across from him in the visiting room, her expression unreadable. "I've been going through Carrera's personal effects," she said without preamble. "His lawyers are settling his estate." Marcus said nothing, waiting. "I found some interesting items in his safe deposit box. Surveillance equipment, photos of you and your wife, audio recordings going back 3 years." She paused. "And a detailed plan for framing you for your wife's murder." Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. Hope, maybe, or vindication, but it was too late for either. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because I think I made a mistake," Chen said quietly. "I wanted justice for my grandmother so badly that I didn't look hard enough at the evidence. I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment. Will you reopen the case?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. "The evidence is circumstantial. Carrera's dead, so he can't testify about his motivations. And you did help kill my grandmother, Marcus. That part isn't in dispute. So I stay here." "Yes, you stay here." She stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I believe you didn't kill your wife. But I also believe you got what you deserved for what you did to an innocent old woman." After Chen left, Marcus returned to his cell and thought about Rebecca, about Mrs. Chen, about all the innocent people who died because of the choices made by guilty men who thought they could control the consequences of their actions. In the end, they'd all been victims of a system that confused revenge with justice and punishment with redemption. The guilty had won by becoming innocent in death, while the innocent were left to carry the burden of guilt for the rest of their lives. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to remember Rebecca's laugh, the way she looked in the morning light, the life they'd built together before his past caught up with them. But even those memories were tainted now, poisoned by the knowledge that their happiness had been built on a foundation of lies and blood. In the darkness of his cell, Marcus finally understood the true meaning of justice. It wasn't about punishment or redemption or even revenge. It was about living with the consequences of your choices, even when those consequences destroyed everything you love. Subscribe and like if you enjoyed the video.